Hey everybody, BTO Pro here. I'm going to be doing a presentation I gave at Drupal GovCon Day called PureSpeed. So this talks all about performance through the lens of how we're doing things in Elms Learning Network, but lots of lessons you can learn for any Drupal site. We also focus on 7, but there's some talk of 8 in here as well. So hope you enjoy. So who's that guy? I think you know who he is at this point. It's me, the voiceover, BTO Pro. I'm head of the Elms Learning Network project. I work at Penn State, and I don't stop talking about Drupal because it's awesome. You can find out more about Elms at elmsln.org or fork our repo on GitHub. There's lots of performance stuff in there, among other crazy things. So, what are we going to do in this talk? We're going to look at some tools and identify problems and needs you have, do some general server optimizations, Drupal 7 and 8 optimization, and fixing common front-end delivery issues. Now, in the talk that I gave originally, I actually took a site, broke it, and then kind of reverse engineered how to fix it. If you were to find a site in the wild, we're not going to do that today. But some things worth playing around with. Devil project, Devel, lets you do all kinds of nice querying of monitoring queries and memory usage. I also encourage people to hack core. It's not a very popular mentality, but as a PHP hacker, as far as learning, I have to kind of deconstruct things to figure them out. I highly recommend you do the same. Thing that really make Drupal make sense to a lot of people, I think, is figuring out what it's calling in what order, right? Because you've got kind of this like wheel, if you think of it as a wheel, spinning and spinning and spinning, and everything hooks on with the hook-based architecture. I realize this is lessened in 8, but there's still the hooks are all there. So if you throw a DPM into module invoke all, which is an includes module.inc in Drupal 7, you can see the order at which things load. It's pretty useful. So then you can figure out what point in the execution, chain you want to jump in, try and start to debug like what is a costly function if you do some memory profiling. So XHProf is another tool to do this type of stuff. But I did a blog post on Drupal.php.edu about memory profiling and hooks, in which I use this DPM and output some memory data to kind of get into each individual hook and find hooks that are expensive calls, fix them. Another great tool for doing some digging is New Relic. So New Relic lets you see the queries, lets you see what's going on in the box in real time. This is a chart from a client that I had. It came in to fix something. Basically, this the example in this thread, if you go to this link, demonstrates what the issue was. But effectively, there was a module enable that is incorrectly placed in a block for this one module. And so what you would see is your chart in New Relic will look something like this. It's normal, 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 and then cache miss would basically down the server because of this module enables. And then you can see other windows of large outage as a result of these, module enable calls. So New Relic really helped us trace this down. It's something we contributed back to the project in question, which you can read about at that link. So some additional optimizations, I would highly recommend dropping mod PHP. That's the default way of interpreting PHP at an Apache layer. It's really a memory hog. It's slow. You can cause your server to lock up. You can't really hit high scale. If you get a lot of traffic all at once, Apache just kind of shuts itself off. If you switch to FPM, PHP FPM is a different process. And so Apache basically gets the request and goes, what do I do with this? Oh, it's PHP, here you go, and hands it off to PHP to process. And one of the really nice things with PHP FPM is that it kind of just queues up. So let's say you get 100 requests, Apache would open 100 servers or server threads and try and deliver them one at a time. If you don't have 100 available, Apache locks up and dies. PHP FPM though, if you don't have 100 available, it says, oh hey, you 10 sit in the queue. Once I'm done with these, I'll get to you. And so it's a lot faster in turning things around. A lot more memory optimized, a lot easier to isolate. It's just everything's better about it, quite frankly. um, uh, Bear in mind, this is talk given to GovSpace. GovSpace EDU a lot of times are using things like Rel 5, Rel 6. I don't even think this is default in Rel 7, to be perfectly honest. I haven't tried it in a while. But anyway, worth exploring if you're sysadmin or if you can, go and make the switch to PHP FPM. It's a life-altering experience, we'll say. Some other things you can do with the server is tuning PHP. So you've got your INI file. You probably shouldn't modify that directly. Modify other files around it, but Zend Opcache is a must. It's not on by default everywhere, so make sure you have, if you have newer versions of PHP, make sure you have Zend Opcache enabled. If you have older versions of PHP, make sure you have APC. I also still use APCU, which APCU is user bin, and so user bin allows you to stuff database cache tables in Drupal, which we'll talk about a little later, for cheap and dirty fast server. You can find more about this tuning and PHP things you can do as far as Opcache, even going beyond default Opcache settings based on some testing we did at PureSpeed-PHP-tuning on Drupal.php.edu. Basically caches the files and where they are in memory, so that it's a lot easier to find them next. And with Drupal, you've got tens of thousands of files you're pulling together. You better cache where they are, or else you're going to have to queue that up every time. PHP 5.5 plus uses Zend Opcache, and below 5.5, if you're in the 5.1 through 5.4 universe, APC is the way to go. There's also these two settings that Mike Harper, I always point to his work. He does advanced ag and some other things in the community. It's awesome on performance issues. Setting these two values higher than their defaults is important for Drupal, just because it's got a lot more files, and so you need to cache bigger files and size and things like that. Some other optimizations: MySQL land. So etsy.my.conf is where this file typically is. Most common issue with any Drupal site, because of views, typically, or rules, or anything that pulls together a lot of queries, is going to be max allowed packet. Default max allowed packet, because of the age of MySQL, and I swear, just so that they can generate revenue with this issue, is 1 meg. I don't know any application that makes sense anymore. So I generally set this at 32. A couple sites have had to set it as high as 64. Rare that you have to go above 32 though. Make sure that you disable the caching engine built into MySQL, which is counterintuitive for sure. But Drupal actually does a really good job at caching queries, and so you don't need two engines effectively trying to cache data that's going to be kicked out. The MySQL caching is kind of like accounting for poorly written code, and that's not to say Drupal's perfect, but Drupal's cache bin management system is fantastic, so just let it do its thing. Also ensure that your tables are InnoDB encoding. There's a project, APDQC, that'll help you kind of find some of these little things. But APDQC is a drop-in replacement for the MySQL cache bin engine in Drupal 7. It's got a lot of stuff backported from Drupal 8. And basically, the goal is to eliminate deadlocks. The deadlock is, you've got something hanging out, waiting to release a table, and another command comes in and says, hey, I got to read that. And the first command is saying, or first session is saying, no, you have to wait till I'm done. This can lead to 10, 20, 30-second wait times in devastating type of scenarios. And so what APDQC does is it does asynchronous reads and writes to cache tables, and does some other crazy, tricky stuff like emptying tables by renaming them and things like that, which really just crush deadlocks. It's pretty awesome. It also gives a report on how to optimize your server further with like copy this command, paste it here type of feedback, and has like button clicks to optimize tables and things. So highly recommend highly recommend using it and looking into it if you're still in Drupal 7 land, as so many of us are. So cache bin management in general. Did you know that you can swap out the cache bins in Drupal core? Um, Thank you, large clients that needed this capability. There's a blog post I have that has more on this with PureSpeed cache bin backends. But basically, you can tell Drupal not to look in MySQL for cache data. Now, generally, you want to put cache data in MySQL. If you look at the Drupal database layer, you're going to see like cache underscore page and cache underscore cache and cache underscore views data and all those type of things. But if you can keep things out of MySQL by having them just be in memory, then you skip the load on MySQL, and memory is, I'm not going to say free, but basically free as far as a performance perspective, as close to free as you can get on a read. So the more stuff you can push there, generally speaking, the better from a load perspective. And so APC user bin is great for things that don't change. It doesn't have garbage collection, which may or may not mean anything to you, but basically that means that memory gets filled up and doesn't know how to, replace things that it doesn't need anymore. So a lot of really, cheap and dirty solutions to get a much faster Drupal site on low resources is use APCU as the place that MySQL's writing to, or writing its cache data, and then it's going to read from that cache data, and you're going to hit the file system, generally speaking. But with APCU, you're going to hit the memory band. Well, memory is basically free, said. And so it doesn't do garbage collection. So restart Apache nightly or something. I do this all the time on personal projects, things where it's like, hey, I want to throw up a $10 server, to power like a hockey league website or something, right? I don't want to spend a lot of money, but I do want to hit a pretty decent scale and be able to hit some serious speed. So APCU is good for that type of stuff. File cache allows you to write to the file system. I probably should spell things correctly. Write to the file system for cache data, which is historically bad. But now as we move into the age where SSDs are basically everywhere, that's going to be pretty darn close to what APCU would give you. Plus, you have garbage collection because it's on the file system. So that's going to increase your reads and writes to the file system. So you need to have solid state drives. Also, a caution with file cache: it can be a little finicky. To get set up initially, you might get some white screen of deaths and things like that in the process of getting there. So don't just go switching over to it on a production server. Memcache is very popular. Memcache and Redis will lump together. They're very similar. A distributed cache pool, basically. You just got a ton of RAM sitting out there on servers dedicated just to that purpose, and then hit them for it. Mike Garber actually said you don't really need those anymore with APDQC doing what it does. So I just personally think Memcache and Redis increase complexity, and I'm not really in favor of solutions that do that, generally speaking. So as I mentioned, warning on cache bins, right? There's some things to care about here. Look out for white screen of deaths. It's not a deal breaker, but you have to be aware it's possible. You might need to do a registry rebuild, something like that, in order to switch over to these cache bins. Cache form cannot be cached. This is very important. Drupal writes important session information to cache underscore form, and so it needs that so that when you fill out a form and hit submit, that it's kind of cached what that value is on the one side to validate it on the other. If you do if you switch the cache bin of cache form to not be in MySQL, there's a high likelihood that you're going to end up getting all of your submission forms, which is every page in the site, complaining that like this is unauthorized edit, or this has been modified by another user, or things like that. Nasty stuff. So just don't do it. APC, if you use APCU, has fragmentation issues, as mentioned. And make sure that you can do the APDQC recommendations, although a lot of them require that you're above MySQL 5.5, which not everyone is. MySQL 5.4 brings in enough of the things that you can at least do a lot of the recommendations, but 5.5 and above is where you're really going to see the performance gains with it. So what's some ways you can warm the cache? And so warming a cache means that if it takes Drupal a while to build a page for a user, why don't we just build the page for them so that they get delivered a static copy? And so some ways you can do that, I wrote this module called HTTPRL Spider, which uses the HTTPRL module written by M. Carper, which allows for background and parallel processing of commands by sending off non-blocking calls. And so I've taken that idea and said, well, then we can send off non-blocking calls to ourselves to basically have Apache and PHP FPM or whatever serve up the page to these fake anonymous users, and it loops through every entity type. So you can queue it up to just run, have the commands here. Hey, do a HSS, which is HTTPRL self-spider against all nodes, which will hit every node on the site, going through slowly one at a time. Actually, it does them in batches of 50, I think. Other thing, in addition to this, let's say you have an authenticated user site, you use Authcache, which we will not be talking about, but is useful in D7 land. XML RPC page load can be queued up in such a way with the hiss command so that it acts as if user 1 accessed the page. So you can simulate a user accessing the page, which may sound like a security issue, except it doesn't deliver the page. So it basically just tricks Drupal into seeding all of its cache bins, but then it never delivers the page out the other side. So you could trigger something this way. I'm sure that wouldn't be terribly wonderful, but since it's only plugged into the hiss command, it's not going to happen. It's not sending any data back. These are great approaches for seeding anonymous or authenticated user data. There are other ways to do it. You can use XML sitemap module, and then just like there's a cron tab thing you can drop in Spider, but I generally have this type of a cron spider, if you will, in my file. So that's etc cron tab is where you can go and modify the cron for what your Linux operating system is going to run at what hours. So this one says to run crons on all my sites at 4 a.m. and then at 4:15 seed the caches on everything. So I'll do this on a lot of, again, like low resource type of stuff so that it appears really high scale. Varnish, I'm not going to go into a ton, but Varnish is a reverse proxy. You can throw it in front of Apache, and so then the traffic asks Varnish, hey, do you have page 2? Varnish goes nope and asks Apache. Apache goes nope and asks Drupal and MySQL and all that funness. They deliver it to Apache, and then Apache delivers it to Varnish. Now, whenever anyone else requests item 2, Varnish goes, yeah, I know it, here it is. So basically it skips the entire backend process. It can't handle HTTPS, although I have this preface of without 4.x version of Varnish, which apparently can. You can also use Nginx, which is more performant. I generally don't like using Nginx just because there's more support and more documentation around Apache. I mean, Apache is the old slow dinosaur in this area, but it's a lot better documented, especially for a full stack developer like me. Drupal 7, so these are some modules you should get, absolutely. Entitycache, this is core in D8. It caches entities and object definitions. Why the hell didn't it do that by default? But this is gonna, it's required for things like field collections or complex entities that you have modeled in your site for sure. APDQC, mentioned a few times. Definitely look into putting that on your D7 sites. 7 and 8, there's advanced ag, ADVAGG, which will aggregate and compress CSS and JavaScript files in a way that's better than core. Now, core does have the ability to compress CSS and JavaScript so that your 20 modules that supply them mashes them into 1 or 2 files. That's pretty good, but ADVAGG was made to do that in a much more logical way. So you can actually define, hey, take these 20 files and smash them into 4. And so it'll try to figure out based on usage, and appearance of the files it's aggregating, which of those 4 files it should put them in. So like your theme layer, CSS, and JavaScript is going to sit in a file that's mashed with some other things that appear on every page. As a result, after you get that initial load on the site and you navigate around, every page is going to be faster because there's less and less JavaScript and CSS that has to be delivered again. So this is really good when you get into like front-end performance, but beware, some of the options can brick your JavaScript if it's poorly written. So just fiddle with it. Generally speaking, you can do things like move JavaScript to the footer, which is better because then it's not blocking the rendering of the page. There's some stuff around asynchronous font loading, which is pretty impressive, but doesn't work on all of my sites. So things to look at. HTTPRL I mentioned briefly. There's something like this in D8 Core called Guzzle. It allows you to queue up background processing threads and non-blocking calls. I did some benchmarks, which you can go to those links on drupal.psu.edu to see blocking versus non-blocking, and I mean it's night and day. If it's something you don't need a message to keep moving with execution, right? Like let's say you want to run the cron on another site. I don't want to wait around till cron finishes. So HTTPRL allows you to send off a message to that cron, but keep going and not care about, basically hangs up. I mentioned APC, so this is what an APC cache bin configuration might look like. We've got our cache bins defined as to what's safe to cache in APC, and then we've got pointing to the APC cache backend in Drupal. This would go in your settings.php. Authcache is something that's, fortunately in Drupal 8 there really isn't a need for something like this anymore. But this can allow you to cache and deliver pages and parts of pages to authenticated users while the majority of the page is still delivered in a more cacheable, anonymous manner, if you will. Basically, the pages get delivered, and then JavaScript rewrites and little server-side includes rewrite the areas of the page, to be specific to whoever the logged-in user is. So, very complicated, very difficult to get implemented correctly. We go back and forth about including this by default in Elms Learning Network all the time because certain builds have it on by default and it's caused issues, and other builds don't have it on by default, and we go, wow, it'd be nice to squeeze some extra performance out. So food for thought. BigPipe is something in Drupal core D8.1 and above, and this is kind of similar to the previous thing, where it's going to deliver the page, figure out the blocks or what have you that is different for this user, or maybe these things aren't cached, and then it's going to serve those up in a separate processing call. Going a step further with that, if you look at something called Refreshless, which is similar to the turbo links technique from Rails, Refreshless is pretty awesome because it asks in the background, hey, what's about to change between the page you're on and the next page, and then only delivers those items and then only changes those items. You can see something like this on GitHub where you click and you'll notice you're not actually going to the page. There's a background processing bar, which is what I have the arrow pointing at, and then it delivers you just the part of the page. This is to reduce strain on Apache and different engines that would have to deliver you every asset of the page when they're going to be basically the same every time. And so this is where I would have looked at an inherited site in our live session. But let's try and move this, bulldozer of front-end performance by looking at some ways you can optimize that. So these are things a lot of times you can do without needing to have access to any backends at all. But YSlow is the one I prefer the most. And so you get the YSlow plugin for Firefox or Chrome. Gives you a score of your site and what you can do to make it better or faster, perceived faster, as well as actual faster. So if you have things like e-tags and the headers set correctly on the files that need to be delivered to the user, subsequent loads won't ask for those files. So what does that mean? Well, it means your server is getting hit with less requests for the same stinking data, but also the end user doesn't have to wait for those files to show up. Page speed is another one. This is by Google. It's built right into Chrome. It's in the audits tab. I don't really like this one as much. It doesn't give as useful information. I still run it, but I think YSlow is just a lot easier to read. It's a lot more user friendly. It's something you could take to someone and say, hey, can we fix this if you don't have the ability to. You can also go to webpagetest.org and it'll do similar tests to YSlow and give you reports. It's pretty cool. And so that gets into, asset delivery, as mentioned. So make sure the E tags make sense, expire headers that make sense. Like, if there's an image that's the banner of your page, it should be telling the browser, hey, this is going to be the same for the next month or year for all I care. And so these logical headers make Apache happy and make your users happy too. So some basic things you can do with Apache is compression, so that sending less of the same result, E tags so that things validate, expires headers so that people keep stuff for a while, keep alive, max clients, really getting into the weeds with these things. But there's a file in Elms Learning Network called zzz_performance. It's got zzz so it loads last. But highly recommend checking out. And even if you don't drop it in and use it on your site, at least piecing some of the things out of there. We pulled together, Brad and I pulled together a lot of recommendations from different sites, informing that as a pretty decent baseline to make. I drop it on any server that's running Drupal at this point and makes it faster and subsequent page loads and things. Some other last notes, in advanced ag, make sure that you're pushing CSS and JavaScript to the footer when you can. This is a big deal when it comes to perception of speed, because user's going to get the page, JavaScript has to fully load before it will render anything in the browser. It's just the way it works. So if that JavaScript's at the top of the page, you're not going to see anything until it's all loaded. So if you force it to the bottom of the page, if you can, a lot of apps and things you can, then the user will see the page. It might technically not be fully functional for the first second or so, but it's really important to get that first paint down when you're trying to attract someone to your site and to bother to look. Fixing the CDN category. So there's this CDN module for those of us that can't afford a CDN. And the CDN module is rather brilliant. It tricks browsers into being able to parallel load a lot more files. Now, this is less of an issue than it once was. Most browsers now support parallel loading of lots of files. But nice thing, if you use CDN correctly, even if it's against your own domain, basically you create subdomains and alternate pathways to your Drupal site. You can then tell Apache to strip all of the cookies and things off of those. So it makes them even faster and even more static because there's no data that needs to flow. So if you serve up images and CSS and JavaScript that is effectively never going to change, then you can gain a lot there. Also, it's good to look into if you can put your theme files or fonts on a CDN. So Bootstrap theme has built-in support for using the Bootstrap CDN and a couple other CDNs. There's a high likelihood that someone going to your site has been to a site that uses Material CSS if it's Google, or uses Angular, or uses Bootstrap CDN or Foundation CDN or jQuery CDN. And so if any of the users are coming to your site, why would you serve up the same stinking files again from you when they could just be hitting them from the CDN? At that point, there's a good chance they've already been to a site and have that file cached locally in their file system, so then it's even faster for them. So definitely check out CDNs. And just in general, try to make less requests. An interesting project is trying to achieve this is CSS EM image. And so CSS EM image takes like things that would normally be sprites and smaller images on the site. You might have a lot of icons that are
not font-based icons. The world seems to go back and forth between whether we should use font-based icons or images. But CSS EM image takes all those images, turns them into base 64 encoding, and then smashes them into the page. So then they still load as the image, but they can be cached as a static text in a file. So pretty neat approach. But good luck. You realize you're using a modular CMS framework, and they are, a little bloated because you've got all these, this modularity. So do the best you can. If you can pull, above an 84 or so on Y-slow, you're doing pretty good. I think the highest I've ever been able to pull is like a 95, and that was on a very simple site. I try to shoot for, around 90, 89 to 92. I usually feel like I've done enough from a delivery standpoint. But as always, I'm BTO Pro on Twitter, Drupal.org, and the rest of the stinking universe of the web. Um, so, tweet me, ask questions if you have them, whatever. See you online.